This evening's focus is going to be Europe and particularly also Germany. And for this, we have invited and we welcome, hopefully, as our speaker tonight, this evening, Professor Swen Hutter, who is a professor, the Lichtenberg Professor in Political Sociology at Freie University of Berlin since 2018. And at the same time also the Vice Director for the newly created Center for Civil Society Research at Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin. His research interests are particularly on political conflict, civil society, social movements, protest politics, and party competition. And let me just refer to three prominent publications of his that are also listed on the WZB website. On the one hand, the monograph from 2014, Protesting Culture and Economics in Western Europe, New Cleavages in Left and Right Politics by University of Minnesota Press. Then the co-edited volume, together with Edgar Grande and Hans-Peter Grisi, Politicizing Europe, Integration and Mass Politics, which appeared with Cambridge University Press in 2016, and the co-edited volume, European Party Politics in Times of Crisis, also with Cambridge University Press in 2019. Yes, Professor Hutter, welcome to ZMO. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And yeah, please everyone join me in welcoming Professor Swen Hutter for his lecture entitled How Europeans Got Engaged in the Pandemic. And we've put the abstract of the lecture back in the chat, so if everyone wants to have a closer look or remind themselves. And yeah, Swen Hutter, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for the very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here surrounded by kind of a crowd that maybe I'm kind of a bit foreign to, and maybe my work to you as well. So I'm very much also looking forward to kind of see your reactions, and maybe when we can also put this in a broader comparative perspective. Because I also have to say what I present to you today is really ongoing work. So it's very much a look into my kind of data kitchen right now, because I'm also still trying to make sense of the kind of incoming data and first results on what is actually happening in this period of time. So just that as a little disclaimer, it's not yet the fully thought through kind of a narrative that I can present to you. And because I will present quite a number of descriptive results, I've also prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and I'd like to share that one with you. Okay, I hope you can see it. Perfect. Okay, so that's the title, kind of how did Europeans get engaged in the COVID-19 pandemic or crises? I have to say I will talk a bit about kind of a broader European perspective, then I will zoom in on the German case to kind of illustrate a bit the kind of dynamics that I'm interested in. And maybe just to kind of start with, of course, kind of when we ask ourselves, what did Europeans do in this moment of the pandemic and the crisis? We know after a first kind of moment of shock when we thought politics comes to a halt, so many of our kind of ordinary ways of getting engaged in civil society have been closed off. We couldn't meet and the like. We have, of course, seen quite a wide array of forms of civic and political engagement. I mean, here I just show you one kind of form that was particularly prominent at the beginning, kind of to try to connect oftentimes through digital means with your neighbors, but also maybe doing more symbolic actions on the balcony. My wife is also a singer, and one of her former kind of colleagues in Italy got very famous as being all of a sudden the tenor on the balcony. So I think we all kind of probably have these images in mind, but then of course also images of civil society that do not just focus on cooperation and kind of symbolic support and neighborhood help, but also are more in the business of contestation. Here you can see the digital climate strike of the Fridays for Future movement that we have seen. in April, kind of for the first time emerging. And above, kind of on the right, you can also see one of the early pictures from the so-called Querdenken, like the lateral thinker movement in Germany that contested very much the restrictions that we are all facing these days. So I think we all know kind of these examples. And what I want to do today with you is kind of give this a bit more kind of data. So how strong was actually this mobilization? What kind of form did it take when we look at the major kind of forms in which Europeans got engaged? And of course, apart from just describing like the number and kind of the prevalence, I'm also interested in the social and political implications. And that, I think, comes for me with two kind of add-ons to just looking at the share and the type of kind of citizens engagement that we have seen. One is, of course, the social strata in the European populations that have taken part in these activities, and if that has changed in this moment of a pandemic. The second one is, of course, also looking at the kind of political meanings that were attached to these forms and how easily they sit on pre-existing lines of conflict within Europe. So I try to give you at least a first preliminary answer on how much and what type of engagement have we seen in Europe, and particularly in Germany, and what are kind of the social and political implications that we can already probably see in these first kind of months, and having not yet looked at the long-term development, of course. I will do this in 4 steps. First, just a few kind of words on civil society and crises more general. Then I will focus in 2 main parts on the empirics. First, on the broader questions of activation and deactivation. So how strong was really this mobilization? How much of a share of the population got activated, really got engaged? But we also know for many, it was really kind of a strong break on their previous engagement. So the question is also who got deactivated or disengaged. I will then zoom in on the Corona protests in Germany, because I think they're an interesting example that goes a bit against kind of just the reiteration and reinforcement of long-term trends when it comes to the social and also the political kind of outlook of protest participants and political participants more generally in Europe. And then I will give you some preliminary conclusions. So I will not go too much into theory, and I think we can probably come back to all of this later on. I just want to say I have a very kind of how shall I put it, sector-specific understanding of civil society. So first of all, it's voluntary associations among citizens that go kind of beyond state and market activities. So I don't attach a very normative understanding of civil society to this. And as I already showed you with these pictures, I also have a very broad understanding of civil society when it comes to the types of organizations and voluntary associations, ranging from recreational associations like sports clubs up to kind of the social movements and protest campaigns. And of course, we all know that this pandemic was a special situation and a kind of special challenge for many of us, but also for civil society as kind of an organized entity. Because I think on the one hand, of course, we all know that the risks associated with this pandemic were very unequally distributed in our societies. There was a strong need for state intervention, which of course both kind of raise the need for a strong and also critical civil society. These were kind of, if you wanted, like the push factors that kind of pushed and pulled civil society to do something. But of course, there were also kind of more factors that hindered a rapid kind of emergence of certain kinds of civil society actors. On the one hand, I think for many, including some of the social movement groups and also the kind of later groups that contested what was happening. Of course, these crises is a challenge because it's a multifaceted kind of situation of threats and conflicts. It's not like an economic crisis or the so-called refugee crisis that you can more easily pinpoint what is actually needed, how it is related to pre-existing lines of conflict in society. Just think, if you are these days an artist that is hindered from performing and the like, if you want to get engaged in a certain protest activity, you have to kind of bear in mind all the other layers to your demands of getting kind of a decent compensation or a decent kind of way to continue your work. So I think that's kind of the threat constellation, but of course also initially, and that was a strong kind of warning for many of us, there were also strong restrictions on the standard repertoire. So it was not just about what kind of claim should we actually have and what is needed, but also the question of how can we actually transport this to the political system, and also how can we actually help others in need if, for example, many of the neighborhood associations were not allowed to kind of continue their business. So I think that's kind of what I just want to say at the beginning. There is this kind of dilemma, and it was not that kind of easy to foresee what would happen in terms of the strength of these reactions and also the type of reactions. Of course, from previous crises, and I will also keep this very short, and I've also not added literature here, we of course know that crises, and particularly like natural disasters, and I think if we want to conceptualize the pandemic, it sits somehow in between, has often done kind of a strong harm on organized civil society. It has, to a large extent, in many areas, think of the example of Hurricane Katrina, but also think of the example of the economic crisis in parts of Europe. It has oftentimes destroyed pre-existing social capital, especially kind of more formalized associations had to cope with the fallout of these crises and catastrophes. So what then often happens afterwards is, of course, you sometimes see reinforcement of long-term change, that we see, for example, a reinforcement if more more project-oriented, short-term engagement, for example, as compared to long-term formal associations. But sometimes, of course, crises can also be game changers. And it, of course, depends on the type of situation and the initial reactions on what we actually see. So I'm just putting this out there as an idea. The second one is, of course, also we know from previous crises and catastrophes that when we look then more closely at the social strata that are involved in the immediate kind of responses in terms of civic and political engagement, we see spirals of activation and deactivation. So it's not the same kind of for all social strata to get engaged or not get engaged. And I think also there, some crises have reinforced certain pre-existing political inequalities. So the question of what kind of social strata are engaged in politics and get a voice. But sometimes crises, there also the kind of previous economic crises in Europe is a good example, revert some of these trends. Just think of, for example, the precarious youth in parts of Southern Europe and beyond that was very much mobilized by that crisis. So also there, it's kind of open, and crises are sometimes moments of critical juncture. And finally, of course, we all also know engagement is not politically neutral. And it has not been in previous crises, which maybe were more easily ideological loaded. So who kind of gets engaged on behalf of refugees and in what form is kind of more easily related. But even now in this crisis, it depends on ideological predisposition. So also here the question is, the type of engagement that we see these days, does that just reinforce kind of pre-existing ideological biases within civil society, or is it also a moment when some of these paths could be changed given the severity of the moment we go through and the kind of initial dilemma that I sketched, which is not so easy kind of for individuals, but also organizations to respond to. So this is just kind of to open up a bit the terrain, that at least it's not so straightforward what kind of response we should have actually seen, given these push and pull factors, given that these kind of issues, at least some of them, don't sit so easily on pre-existing cleavages and divides within European societies and Germany. So now let me give you kind of two pieces of of empirical evidence for these issues. First, on this activation and deactivation. And here I will draw just one slide on a recent project that I got through the Berlin University Alliance, the BUA, a special call on the pandemic. And I do this with Jule Specht, the personality psychologist, and Christian von Schewe. And the idea was really to kind of get some on-the-ground data to kind of see how strong was this engagement, how was kind of engagement still implemented, but also to look at the flip side, who actually benefits from engagement. We do this, we did surveys in 5 European countries, and we also did an organizational survey in Germany, and I'm very happy to also report on that one, because here I will just stick to the population survey. And this is just the project once more, just in a graphical form. I will now just sketch a bit this kind of survey analyses, and maybe at the end in the discussion, I can also come back to the 5th work package, where we try to link a bit the organizational supply of what was still possible to be given as opportunities for citizens' engagement and the engagement of individuals. Now, here just a few data kind of on the survey. We did this in October, so when I present you now the data, it's kind of citizens looking back at what they did from March, when the kind of main restrictions were implemented in most of the European societies for the first time, up to October. From another survey, I also have data for the very early phase, but we can maybe also come back to that. We will do now a follow-up in Germany to have some kind of also panel data, but that's maybe not so important. We have, of course, question batteries on civic and political engagement in this moment, but also what people did in the past. And that's kind of what I will focus on today. So now here, just quite long batteries, but I thought maybe you just would like to take a look yourself. This was the longest batteries that the respondents had to fill out, and they then had to tell us, did they do this? And then they also had to answer how often, from never, rarely, up to very often. So I just give you a short moment to maybe reflect on your own behavior or just read the list. As you can see here, the list is very exhaustive. So it does not just include very classical kind of forms of civic engagement, which would be rather the ones at the bottom of donations and voluntary work in an organized format, but also very daily routine help that you do even for members of your family, but those that don't live within the same household. On top of that, we then also ask the battery, which is more standard in political participation research, with kind of the standard forms of political participation. And now the very simple empirical question is, of course, how much have we seen? No? If we just take now kind of the difference between those that have never done these activities and the ones that have at least occasionally gotten engaged in these different forms of activity. And the first ones are really very simple kind of bar charts that I would like to show you. So here you see any of these two forms. So if someone has said any of these kind of civic forms, the ones on the left and the ones on the right, they're shown in here now. And you can see the share of the population here as a ratio in these 5 countries. And as you can see here with the green part, bar, if we kind of have such a broad understanding of participation and such a kind of a narrow threshold that you do it at least occasionally, it's more than 80% of the surveyed kind of respondents that say that they have done any of these in this kind of moment of since the beginning of the pandemic. And you can also see, that's why I will not do too much on cross-national variation today, not just because I'm not yet fully there with my analysis. There is not that much of variation in the level, at least. You can then see, of course, political engagement is always kind of rarer, even in normal times, but you can still see it's about 40–45% of the population that have also engaged in at least one of these forms throughout the last few months. Again, here you can see not too much of a difference. It's only Germany and Sweden are a bit smaller kind of in participation levels. So let's look at the kind of these groups of these action repertoires, and I've grouped these different items together. First, when we look at what I call civic engagement, very broadly defined, and I will show you here just the data for Germany because I want to focus on Germany, but it looks very similar for the other countries. I look at emotional support. That involves kind of really emotional support proper, listening to others, kind of caring for others, but also the symbolic actions on the balcony, daily routine help from shopping, childcare to others. And then, as said, these more kind of formal civil society activities in organized forms like volunteering and donating. And you can see here, of course, what is very prevalent and goes up to 70% is, of course, emotional support, this help in daily routines. It goes much lower, of course, when you look at voluntary kind of activities and donating, but still there, we're close to 40% of Germans that have done that in this moment of the pandemic. Could now say this is actually what I would have expected given all the kind of images that we also had in media reporting. The question is then, what about political engagement, where many feared that this is not a moment for politics, many forms are not out there, we're silenced. The question is there, of course, here you can see the bar does not go that much high up, but that's also under normal circumstances. But you can still see about a third of Germans have engaged in any online activity that was political, like posted something political, took part in a protest online. Then I've kind of here aggregated party activism, so engaged in any form of action organized by party or contacted politicians. And finally, even protest in the public space. So not just online protests, we still see about 13–14% of the Germans that did that in this pandemic. So that's kind of the first thing. Now we could say it looks very standard. There has been quite some kind of politics out there and some engagement. But the question is, of course, as I said before, much more fundamental of is this now different to pre-crisis situations, and who actually got engaged here? So does it really reinforce certain political inequalities or not? And to analyze that, I show you here now the same data, but looking at 4 different groups within our survey respondents. And I called them for the time being inactive. So those that report they were not active pre the pandemic in 2019 and also not now. And the active one, that are those that kind of report they've done this before and they're still doing it. And the most important categories, at least for this analysis, are the deactivated ones. So those that kind of got out of these arenas of associational life and politics, and those deactivated ones that kind of got in this moment of the pandemic. Now here you can see again for these overall figures, of course, for civic engagement, this is not much news. I mean, because the level of engagement was already so high pre-crisis of about 80%, there is not so much of an activation surge. The activation surge with the 7% is a bit higher than those that actually had to leave these forms of engagement, but it's not that strong. If we then look at the different forms, and I don't want to spend too much time here, you can see, of course, emotional work, a little even only daily routines, kind of there is more, but it's also not an activation surge. We see a little decline in organized activities on the other hand. When we then look at political engagement, again, overall, there is kind of a stable active base, but we see at least around 7–8% of those that got activated and deactivated. Again, this differs to some extent across forms as expected. Online activities had more people that got active that were not active before. Party activity, it's about the same. And street protests, there you can really see, given that about 10% of the population in Germany say I've protested in 2019 and also now, there is quite some share of about 7% that are no longer active in these forms of politics, and there is about 3% that came in. Now, you could also say, and I was first also a bit, these are so small numbers, there is not much change in terms of activation, deactivation. But of course, if you take it relative, because we know not all people are engaged, then you can still see that there is some exchange of people engaging and non-engaging. So here, just look at maybe the third kind of bar for organized activities like volunteering and donating. You can see, compared to the active ones in 2019, there is still about an exchange of about a fifth of the people that are engaged in these activities. So about 20% come in and about 20% leave and about 25% come in. And these relative figures are, of course, even stronger when you look at some of the political activities. And as I said before, with protesting, we really see an exchange of the crowd of people that got engaged. So about 40% that did it before, relative to all that were active in 2019, are no longer there. And it's about 15% that come in. Now, this, of course, as a sociologist, then raises the question, but who are these people? And is that kind of rather the politically more relevant question and socially more relevant question, because apparently there was not a halt on these forms of engagement. So here I show you, based on regression analyses, for 4 standard types of socioeconomic factors, from gender, education, age, and income, if there are some significant kind of changes in which groups are more visible compared to the reference. So when you look at gender, the question of, given these exchanges of who comes in and out, is there a bias that women are less present in these arenas, or is it rather that men are less present, or vice versa? And here you can see the results. For civic engagement, you can see there are some kind of changes, and it is not by coincidence that particularly for any form of civic engagement, and particularly emotional labor, it is women that are overrepresented among the ones that got into these forms of politics and had to shoulder kind of these burdens. Whereas for organized forms of civil society activism, like volunteering and donating, it's exactly the opposite. So there it's men. Although pre-crisis we have no longer seen a strong gender effect, we can see there a gender effect. I think the age effect and also the income effect are maybe not so surprising. They also reinforce what we have seen before. Some of them are kind of more younger as compared to the elder that were pushed out of these forms of activism. The same holds for the people of poorer strata in the society. Now, when you look at political forms, again, you see a very strong gender effect. And again, it mirrors organized civic engagement, that you can see that women were crowded out of politics, at least compared to men, but also in absolute terms in Germany. You can also see the same holds for the older population, even for online forms, party activism and the like. There is kind of a disengagement of the older people as compared to the younger. One interesting finding is for protest, we see a reversal of what usually happens. Usually we all kind of, it's a standard finding that the higher educated you are, the more likely you are to protest in a European society. And that has reversed. So there we see some kind of changes in the sign of who got activated and deactivated. Whereas for most other forms of engagement, it has just reinforced long-term inequalities within European societies and European politics. So the preliminary conclusion is that we see fairly high levels of civic and political engagement across Europe. So politics has not come to a halt over the full period of time, but even in the initial phase of the first 3-4 months, our survey results show quite high levels of engagement. We see reinforced inequalities, particularly for gender, that women are crowded out of political arenas, but we also see some reversals, and that is mainly education and protest politics. And that's what brings me now to the kind of second empirical part, and then I'm done with this here. Of the presentation is, has that something to do with the new conflict constellation that we are facing? Because the rest kind of feels like it's just business as usual, but it's just reinforcing what we have seen. But maybe with protest politics, there is something that is more specific to this pandemic. And that's why I would like to zoom in now on the Corona protests as, at least in numbers, one of the core kind of forms of mobilization and campaigns that we have seen in Germany throughout this period that I'm talking about, from March up to October 2020. Maybe you remember some of these headlines here. It's kind of a bizarre alliance with Gandhi and violent activists against Corona and the system. So it was also a moment when the media and many scholars had to kind of make sense of what is actually happening here. Maybe some of you being in Berlin also remember these pictures, that the kind of biggest crowds that we have seen last year in the streets of this city have been in August, these so-called Querdenker demonstrations, so the lateral thinkers that say they are kind of beyond any kind of political leaning, they're against kind of the current measures, and they're kind of, some of them claim because they're a breach of the constitution. So the question is really, what comes in with these people, no? And is that kind of something that is specific to this pandemic and reverts some of these kind of patterns that we have seen before, so that the crisis could be something like a critical juncture? I will draw here on a second project. I will not talk much about this because I think you will see this later. So just in the last kind of 15 minutes, I will first tell you, but how do these Corona protests fit into established categories of conflict? So a bit more theory, and then tell you a few results about who supports these protests. I think in a very classical understanding of conflict in Europe and beyond, we have this idea that social conflict, there are at least 3 types of conflicts. There is class conflict, mainly around economic issues. There are value conflicts around ideas of good society, appropriate behavior. And there are, of course, autonomy conflicts. This is kind of the classical world of Steinrocken and Seymour Lipset and others. And I think what also these kind of Rockanian world of conflict highlights is that there are clear-cut oppositions then within society and the political system that mobilize these oppositions. We can clearly identify the social groups, but also the political formations. And the idea is just that for these Corona protests, it's not easy to just subsume them under one of these categories, but it's a slightly different type of category of conflict, which we in the project would call risk conflicts. So they come from a different idea of what is right and wrong, and they don't sit that easily with these pre-existing cleavages. And one thing is, of course, because they invoke many different dimensions of conflict. And one is really an epistemological idea of conflict that goes beyond interest conflicts or value conflicts. It's really about the kind of uncertainty and what is actually a fact and what is truth and what is wrong. No? So it has this idea of what is this actually all a hoax or not? So that is kind of what makes them different. Then, of course, on top of that, you have normative conflict lines. Many actors out there in public would not deny the dangerous nature of the virus, but of course have very different understandings of how much risk an individual, but also societies at large should carry. On top of that, we see redistributive conflicts on who should carry the burden of all of this, but also who should actually be the authorities responsible. I mean, in this country, in Germany, of course, also questions about federalism, the involvement of the European Union, and the like. So it's a very complex conflict structure. And what I would argue is one thing that makes these risk conflicts different to these other constellations is one is it invokes a multitude of political oppositions. And that means the political potentials, those people that could possibly mobilize on the different sides of these conflict line, they are at least at first cut politically diffuse, because they don't align that easily with pre-existing conflicts between the left and the right, or also the cosmopolitans and the communitarians in this country. On the other hand, they're also socially more heterogeneous than kind of many of the classical conflicts. Now, of course, I'm not the first one that talks about risk conflicts, and many of you know probably the work by Ulrich Beck, Anthony Giddens, and the like, that, I mean, it's modernization theory and kind of questions of late modernity have always invoked questions of risk, be it financial risks, technological risks, and the like. But interestingly, if you look back at the writings, for example, of Giddens, they were all aware of this multiplicity and all these articles about beyond and left and right. But what Giddens then says here in one of his writings on that is that there is no single agent, group, or movement that, as Marx's proletariat was supposed to do, can carry the hopes of humanity these days. So, but there are many points of political engagement which offer good cause for optimism. So writing under the background of these movements of the 70s, 80s in Europe that were also very much at the forefront, like the environmental movement of risk conflicts, the idea was there is now just more opportunity for participation. There are different spheres of life that can be attacked. And I think what we see now in the pandemic is, and not just starting with the pandemic, that actually the sign of who is kind of out there critically mobilizing these risk conflicts has changed from a more progressive to a more regressive side. And that's, I think, what these Corona protests are about, if I would like to give you one interpretation. I will now just jump very briefly. We've also done some media analyses to show how important they were, these kind of activisms around Corona. And of course, in the first place, to also assess how strong, compared to other kind of Corona-related grievances, were these actors that really went full on to criticize the system and kind of go to kind of mobilize on these broader type of risk conflicts. And very simply put, here you can see the number of Corona-related protests that we found in 2 German media outlets. And you can see on the one hand all of them, and on the other hand you can see this so-called Querdenker mobilization. I will not go too much into details, but you can see there were 3 waves of mobilization, already a very strong wave with many small-scale events around April, May. But there, the kind of scope of what was articulated was still much broader than these kind of Querdenker movement. If you look at the number of participants, another kind of standard figure for these kind of type of protest event analyses, you can see, of course, the first wave was much smaller in scale when it comes to the number of participants. The next ones were much larger, and you can also see here, in terms of the numbers of people being mobilized into protest politics in Germany in this period of time, it was very much dominated by this type of mobilization. Now, of course, it's one thing to look at these people and to some extent we've captured them also in the survey. But I think what is more important to understand broader conflicts that are shaping up in society is also how society at large looks at these protest actors. So that's why I will now kind of shift the emphasis to these questions. So how strong is then the actual support for these protests among the German population? And can we see there these kind of heterogeneity in terms of social but also political leanings? So what kind of conflict is shaping up here, and how strong is that conflict? Just once more, two pictures. Here you can see a picture from a demonstration in June in Düsseldorf of these Corona rebels, and the kind of slogan of the demonstration was a festival for peace and freedom to kind of safeguard our basic rights. Of course, many of you might also remember then these pictures, the attempt storming of the Reichstag in August, which was very much criticized also for the heavy kind of presence of the extreme right. But interestingly enough, you can see here exactly the same placard again of the Corona rebels from Düsseldorf. So the question of what are these people and who responds how to them in the German population, I think is a really interesting one. And to do that, I will again rely now on survey data, but this time, as said before, it's not about who got engaged, but it's about these two questions that you can see here. It's much more about how much do you understand the people who participated in these demonstrations against the Corona measures, and also the question of if one were around the corner, would you go there? Would you be a likely participant? We trace this over time, so you will see now also some time trends. Now, first thing, how strong is this potential? We know it was little people that were engaged in street protests. It was much less people that were engaged, of course, relatively speaking, to the German population in these forms of mobilization. But here you can see the support level. On the one hand, this question of understanding on the left, and you can see there is a more or less stable support base, the green line here, of about 18% of the German population that had much or very much understanding. There is another about 20-25% that has some understanding, but at the same time you can also see there is a large majority that has no understanding at all. And what you can see here also is, interestingly enough, when we had seen these incidences in August, the support among those that are really kind of in favor did not shrink very much, but you can see a certain polarization, that those that are really against them kind of increased. And a similar trend you can see in terms of likely participants. It's a significant, I would say, minority of about 13% that is very likely to participate in one of these protests. There is another about 15% that could also think about that, but there is of course a large majority that also increased a bit that would never do that. Now, of course, the question is, who are these people, and do they really represent the different kind of conflict constellation in social and political terms? And for that, I will show you now in the last 5 minutes a few kind of results from a regression analyses, and I will not bother you too much with all of this. I'm also happy to report later on what I did here. Here, this is a regression kind of marginal effects plot. You can see everything that is on the right side of this dashed line there, you can see a positive effect. So one thing that was very kind of clear across all waves is that people that faced economic losses in the pandemic were on average more likely to have understanding for the people protesting in the streets against the state's Corona measures. You can also see on the other hand above there the gender effect. Women, at least on average, were still less likely. But then you can already see there it ends with very clear-cut social structural kind of a basis for the understanding, or it rather shifts over time. So for example, if you look at education, there was not a strong educational effect. It was not at the beginning, the more educated that had less understanding, or vice versa, that has only emerged in later phases. Same holds for example, children at home. At the beginning, there was a significantly larger share of people that had to take care of their children at home, that had support, but that has vanished. But what I just want to tell you here is that they're really socially heterogeneous. So they fit kind of not easy into pre-classified social groupings and cleavages. Now the question is, of course, then, but is there something political that holds them together? And of course, also, how radical are they when we look at pre-existing kind of political classifications? And to do that, you can see here first the left-right placement and the kind of share of people on the different sides of the left-right axis that have understanding. And just look first to the right. So people that really say, I'm on the right and I'm more or less on the extreme right, there you can see already in the first months, June, July, when they mobilized and we asked, there was about 30% of the people that see themselves on the right have much or very much understanding for the Corona protests. If you follow these kind of green bars, you can still see at that moment there was still this kind of U-shaped curve that also on the extreme left there was to some extent an overrepresentation, but that has vanished over time. So the support has shifted to the radical right and is generally right-leaning. Then, of course, if we look at the parties, it is no surprise that the strongest support base for these protests is among the populist radical right party in Germany, the AfD, where by November, it's every second person that identifies or would vote for the AfD is also having much or very much understanding for these protests. You can see also the ones, the bar most to the right, the non-represented, so those that don't see any of these parties as very much fitting or would vote for a party not represented in parliament, there is also some share. Now, the question is, of course, this is relative shares. The question is then, but are they all radical right? When we look at the kind of relative distribution within these groups. And for that, let me just give you another figure, which here you don't see kind of within the right, how strong is the support, but you can see here across all people, and this is the blue thing, that have much or very much understanding, how large is the share of those understanders among these 5 categories of left and right. And what you can see, German society, at least in surveys, has a very strong tendency to the middle. And that also holds for the people that have support for the Corona protests. So about 60% of those that have much or very much understanding would still place themselves in the middle. You can still see this right-leaning shift that, of course, about 25% see themselves much more to the right, and there is the overrepresentation if you compare it with the gray bars. The same holds for the AfD and the voting. Here you can again just see among those that understand these protesters and are the likely mobilization potential of them, what would they vote for? And you can again see the AfD is, if you look at the parties in parliament, by far overrepresented among them. If you look at the party like the CDU, the Christian Democratic Party, it's a minority that is supporting these people. But what you can see here at the same time is also that the non-represented, so the kind of mobilization potential of these groups is not just based on the radical right, it is also based on, as I showed you before, the middle and on those that don't see themselves represented in party politics at all. Now, what unites them then? And that is one thing. I will come to an end very, very quickly. Okay. What unites them is really strong distrust against the government. So it is what unites them is kind of this common understanding of the crisis situation. What also unites them on top of that are conspiracy beliefs. Here is one of the core conspiracy beliefs of the radical right, this idea of a great replacement. And if you enter that into the model, you can see that that is really a strong predictor. Now, are they all conspiracy theorists? Of course not. But still, here you can once more see among those that have much or very much understanding, it's about a third that believes to some extent or largely into this theory. So also larger than the ones that would see themselves on the extreme right. Now, I'm coming to the conclusion, and I'm sorry that I brought a bit too much material. What lessons can we now draw from all of this about the further development of engagement in the pandemic in Europe and these kind of new shape of corona-related conflicts? I tried to show you that I think, at least in terms of levels of engagement, we have seen quite some engagement. But that, of course, we can also discuss, does not mean that civil society as an organized entity was not hard hit, but at least the individual activism was not blocked entirely. When we look at who got in and who got out, we have seen a reinforcement of pre-existing inequalities in participation with a few interesting exceptions. And as I told you, one is protest and the social groups that got involved in protest. And as I tried to show you, that could be something like a critical juncture, that we see kind of a different political potential emerging associated with these risk conflicts, that it's not easily subsumed under standard categories of conflict. And we've also seen, when we look at who mobilized out there in the street, a shift towards these kind of forms of mobilization in Germany. When we then looked at, this is really the last slide, at who understands these people and is the support base, it's about 25%. We have seen in terms of social composition, they're very heterogeneous. They change over time, so they're not yet fixed there. I've tried to show you that at least in political composition, they're also a diverse group, but not completely diverse. They have two strong kind of pillars. One is a radical right flank, and the other one, which I called here, or we call the distrustful, unrepresented center. And at least from a kind of normative standpoint, of course, we have to be cautious about the further development of these kind of mobilization and the mobilization potential, because there is a strong tendency to radical ideas in the form of conspiracy theories. So thanks a lot for hopefully still being here with me and for all your attention.